our practices have been destroying the planet. They seem like a good idea at the time, but right now we have the technology and the ability to change it. And if we don't do it, then we are not behaving properly. And behaving properly, as I see it, is contributing to civilization in a way that it does not degrade over time. We need to create a civilization that is repeatable over time without degrading. That is how what behaving properly is, and destroying our soil function and releasing tons of carbon into the atmosphere is not that.
This is the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast. Revitalizing the world together. Welcome to the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast. This is your host, Neil Collins. It is a show that is supported by our work at Latitude Realty. In it, we explore our natural and built environments and how they can be used as a force for good. The show sets out to inspire impactful ideas, meaningful change, human wellness, and ecological restoration through interviews and easy-to-digest conversations. Our guests range from industry leaders to iconoclasts, from both well-known figures to everyday people leading extraordinary lives. This is a show for people looking for education and inspiration on how real estate can be done differently. Hey everybody, I am really glad to have Hobbs Magaret on the podcast. Hobbs is the founder of Sisters Cattle Company. You are in Sisters, Oregon, where it is 0 degrees. Welcome to the show, Hobbs.
Yeah, thank you. Happy to be here. I appreciate it.
Hobbs, we were talking just before about really some of our experiences, and I found your story on a magazine article online about how you're doing regenerative grazing to help revitalize grasslands and land, but you have such a unique story, and I would love to get into your backstory here.
Yeah, okay, excellent. You know what, sadly, a little bit of an anticlimactic start, the heater just kicked on, and I know it's going to be hard to hear, so let me turn it off. Being that it is 0 degrees, the heater kicked on. So, okay, excellent. Thank you for your patience. So, as I was saying earlier, I think one of the things that made that story so interesting is that the guy who wrote it was named Michael. I'm having a hard time remembering his last name, but he did such a great job of sort of capturing the archetypal arc of the whole thing. And from the very beginning, my granddad was a rancher and a land steward, and my family has been doing this for probably 5 generations. And his name was John Hobbs, my granddad, and he had 3 daughters. You know, every rancher wants a son, but he didn't get one, so he got 3 daughters. And then his first daughter had 3 daughters, so he's got 6 girls basically. And then my mom, who was his youngest daughter, had me. So obviously I got his last name for a first name. It's like the entirety of the heritage is now sort of resting upon my shoulders. So I grew up in the conventional cattle world in the panhandle of Texas and around that. And I wasn't, living on the ranch full time all the time doing that. I did, normal kid stuff. I played soccer and I went to school and had friends and lived somewhat of a suburban, rural, coexistence. And, but spent a lot of time on the ranch and absorbing that culture. And then when I was 17, he died. And kind of that was just the end of the ranching aspect from his side of it. But right then it sort of launched me into this trajectory of really being interested in it. And for the next 4 years, particularly during the summers when I wasn't in school, when I wasn't in college, I was working on the ranches that he had run when he was younger. And so sort of learning from the people who he learned from. And now, mind you, this is all very conventional ranching, big areas, cattle spread out everywhere, focused on the boots and the saddles and the horsemanship and all of that, and very little conversation, if any, about the soil or the plants or the ecology or the coexistence of all of those different aspects and mechanisms working together. So, and he had always said, there's no retirement in ranching. So and I think that's a story that basically all the agrarians of that generation told their kids. which really, the more I think about it, only highlights how that particular variety of agriculture was failing already at that point. Because if it was thriving, people wouldn't say you should go get a job, and they would say, hey, continue doing this, continue making it better. Clearly it's the greatest thing in the world. And there are some people who do that, but the story was always the same. It's like, we make enough to keep doing this. Nobody's thriving. It's not the 1880s where there are massive cattle barons making tons of money anymore, because, obviously that was land dependent. There was a huge amount of land and they could turn out huge amounts of cattle and feed the hungry masses east of the Mississippi. But so I went to college at the University of Oregon here in Eugene, and I got a degree in political science and government. And after that, and I was also extremely devoted to music. I would play guitar 4 or 5 hours a day. And so that was my thing. And because part of that was from my granddad as well. He was a fantastic guitar player, although he never, pursued it professionally. And so me being sort of the bearer of his heritage, it was either ranching or music. And when I decided ranching wasn't what I wanted to do, it had to be music. So, I just poured myself into that, and I, had a mild amount of success through my 20s in playing live, doing albums, and most importantly, composing for media. I did the theme music for Tennis Channel, for what would it be? The Australian Open, the French Open. It's so long ago. The big one in England, I can't remember what that one's called anymore. But basically, I had some success, did some video games, and had a great time of it. And then suddenly, in just one sort of, going back to archetype, one sort of swift stroke of the sword, my wife and I kind of had everything sort of kicked out from under us all at once. We found out the place that we were living in was not zoned for occupancy. I was living in this big warehouse with an apartment on top. And so we were living in this apartment and making music in the studio in the warehouse down below. It was wonderful. It was too good to be true, as we would discover eventually. And so we got evicted from there because we discovered it wasn't, we weren't able to live there. And my business really, for whatever reason, it just stopped. Her business also just stopped. And so we're like, crap, what are we going to do? And then on top of that, we found out in that same basically week-long period that we were pregnant. So we were in what Sun Tzu from the Art of War called killing ground, which is if you find yourself in a place where you can still escape, but if you don't make a move, you're going to die. So we packed up everything and headed to Los Angeles. And we lived in Los Angeles for a year, where we had our kid, and she got this amazing job. You take a risk and hopefully you have a reward from it. And the reward was her getting this wonderful job for a company called Mute 6. That's a digital marketing agency. And she rose very quickly in the ranks there, which certainly lends to the success of the cattle company that we ended up founding later, because marketing is a huge deal. So anyway, I'm sitting there basically taking care of this kid while my wife is that's my daughter Ever. She's lovely. She saved our lives actually by refocusing us on what it is how we needed to live our life, and taking care of her. And I'm like, man, I got to get back into ranching, because that is just what I don't want her to live in Los Angeles. I don't want her to grow up here. I don't want her to go down streets that are clogged with cars, past elementary schools that are surrounded by 15-foot tall fences. It's just like, I don't want her to have that experience. I grew up in the wide open space, and I want her to have that as well. So we're like, you know what? We can work. My wife can work remotely. Let's move back to Oregon. And so we came back to Oregon and decided we were going to start this cattle company. And we started with basically a little bit of startup money and no land, and just started working our relationships and networking. And the part that I kind of missed there was, when I was I started looking for ranch jobs all across the country. And so I would talk to these people here and these people there and these people there, and it was never really a perfect fit. But through that process, I learned everybody's guru, everybody's way of thinking, everybody's book that they should read. And so through all of these, I grabbed all these books and I read all these books and watched all the YouTube videos and all of the documentaries or whatever I could find, all the books, and was able to finally piece together this way of ranching that was totally different from the way that I grew up with, one that is completely in line with nature instead of trying to dominate her and extract from her, and the real turning point was when I saw Alan Savory's TED Talk, when he described the prey-predator effect. And then instantly, the prey-predator effect obviously is bunched up animals migrating across the ground, and obviously disturbing the soil, fertilizing it, processing the carbon that's locked up in the grasses, which is breaking down the cellulose, which nothing can do except microbes, and microbes only live in the soil or in the rumen of a ruminant. So when people tell you we need to stop eating animals, you got to realize that we absolutely have to have ruminants in order to process cellulose, because that's a massive important part of the ecosystem. Anyway, so the turning point was when I saw Alan Savory's TED Talk, and that moment was when I suddenly, all of the degraded lands and all of the degraded ranches I grew up seeing were brought into very sharp focus. And I said, okay, I have to do this. And from then on, I started looking for jobs exclusively in the regenerative world. And there were very few at that time. Nobody was hiring someone who wanted to do what I wanted to do. And specifically what I wanted to do is a style of grazing that was invented by a guy named Johann Zietsman, who, in my opinion, is the greatest, is the most important grazier of the last probably 50 or 60 years. He took what Savory did and made it 10 times better, in my opinion. There are a lot of people who would probably disagree with that. But so Johann Zietsman is my guy, and he popularized a style of grazing basically called ultra high density short duration grazing, and which his student Jaime Elizondo is now calling total grazing, because everybody's trying to find a word that's different from everybody else so they can, market themselves and stand out from the crowd and blah, blah, blah. But so I wanted to do this very specific type of grazing, and Johann had only written his book in 2014. And here it was like 2016, 2017, and nobody knew about him, and nobody was practicing what he did, and nobody even would want to if they knew what it was, which was basically move your cattle 4 times a day and graze them shoulder to shoulder, which even the Savory people don't do. So there were absolutely no jobs out there where I could practice this. So I said, well, hell, I'm gonna have to start my own. So we came back to Sisters and started looking for opportunities, and lo and behold, all you have to do is take that first step, and then things begin to open up.
Well, how did you end up in Sisters? Let's go to that part of the story.
My parents retired. My parents sold their small ranch in the Panhandle of Texas about the time I graduated from high school. And my dad had spent a lot of time in the Pacific Northwest, and he was nearing retirement age, and they wanted to retire up here. So they ended up settling in Sisters. And so I came out here ahead of them. And went to school in Eugene. So they were in Sisters, and then I spent basically 2011 to 2017 or 2016 here in Sisters, and then we went to LA from Sisters, and then came back to Sisters.
Okay, so, for the listeners that are tuning into this, Sisters, Oregon is a pretty small town in Central Oregon, outside of Bend by about half an hour. But what's the population of Sisters? A couple thousand?
I think it's about 2,000 now, 2,500, something like that. The population of Sisters Country, the sort of rich people who ring around the area, is about 10,000. So extremely high property values. It's a nice place to live, but it's definitely got its challenges for sure. But yeah, it's really lovely. Obviously a completely different ecosystem and environment than most people hear when they think Oregon. You think wet and rainy and stuff, but we're in the desert basically. Sisters is on the steps coming down from the mountain, and then you get into the high desert as you leave Sisters by about 10, 15 miles.
So what did you do? You're looking for land or a ranching job. What did you find?
Well, I found there just so happened, as things are. Well, I don't believe in just so happen. I think that we live in a hologram, but personally. And so there was this 60-acre hayfield that was just about a half mile down the road from my parents that nobody was doing anything with, just at all. And it was just sitting there fallow for 2 or 3 years. I'm like, what the heck's going on here? So I came back and I started trying to track down the owner. And, you look at the tax records, and it's some, real estate company that's an LLC that's based out of some other town somewhere. I'm like, well, heck, I can't find these people. And so what I ended up doing was, one day while I was driving by, I just so happened to see a Prius turn off into the forest there, which is the way to get into that property. I'm like, okay, this doesn't look right. This is a Prius driving on this dirt road out in the middle of nowhere. This doesn't look right. So I followed them, and I got to the property, and they had pulled into the property, and I parked outside the property because that's polite. You don't drive under people's property. And then I walked into the property, and the guy who owned the property met me, and we started talking, and I said, hey, I wanted to talk to you about possibly grazing your land, if that would be something you'd be interested in. He's like, well, I've had a few people approach me, but I haven't allowed anybody to do it because I would like this place to be grazed in a very specific way. And I said, oh, well, are you talking about regenerative grazing or whatever? And he's like, yeah, exactly. I said, well, that's exactly what I do, or that's exactly what I'm looking to do.
What are the odds there? Wow.
Yeah, 100% actually. So that's, there's a guy named Jeremy Allen, and Jeremy is just a unbelievable, he's from Connecticut, and he's an unbelievable permaculture, ancient sort of human diet type guy. And, he was heavy on the permaculture side, but didn't have any experience really with livestock. And so we spoke the same language, and we went out to dinner and just hit it off, and to this day we're very, very good friends, and I still graze on his property. So that was the beginning, and from then it just sort of snowballed. And I had been in Sisters for 7 or 8 years before that, and so I've been able to make relationships. And so from the point of view of giving your listeners value, like the most important thing that getting land, the most important aspect of getting land for me was that networking and those relationships, and networking, and also doing something different, because there's no shortage of people in Central Oregon who just throw their cows out on a big pivot and don't move them at all, ever, and don't do any sort of regenerative activity with them. And so it was a huge benefit to me to graze my cattle in a very, very different way, very conspicuously, because people would start being like, okay, well, what's going on here? What's this guy doing? And that combined with the fact that my wife is a really good marketer, and then I started to make some good relationships. And then another key part is there's a local, not really local, but there's a rancher here in Central Oregon who has a big ranch out in Post, Oregon, which is the geographic center of Oregon, named Jim Wood, who is also a large animal vet, who is kind of he grew up in Portland, actually, and we used to work like in a punk record store, and so he has that same kind of weird story that I do, and so he's kind of taken me under my wing. And so from just that one leap of faith coming back to Central Oregon to start this company, through relationships and through doing something really different, I was able to tie together all these little short pieces of string to make one long piece of string that actually makes this go. So
what does it take to set up a ranch from scratch?
From scratch? Well, you have to have a permanent land base, number one, or at least a long enough set of leases that you won't be kicked off without an ample time to find other land. And this actually might not be possible in other parts of the world. Like if you're in Iowa or something like that, everybody's farming the hell out of their land, and they're, nobody's going to be like, oh yeah, I'm not doing anything. But Oregon, and particularly Sisters Oregon, is full of rich people who made their money in Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, maybe Los Angeles, came out here, bought a bunch of land, and they want to keep the tax deferral, but they don't want to do anything with it. And they also want to be part of something cool and hip. And so when you say, hey, I want to put carbon in the soil, they're like, oh, we can graze cattle in a way that does that. Well, yeah, I'm in. Like, sign me up. That'll be great. And so it depends on where you are, how do you start a ranch? Because if you want to buy a ranch, because cattle can't pay for property taxes anymore, or I'm sorry, or for the mortgage. It just doesn't work with the price of land and the commodity prices of cattle, which both of those have problems, certainly. If you look at, obviously the average cost of acre per per average hourly wage of the average American, you know that we're in a totally different place than we were in like 1968 or whatever. And also, you know, cattle prices and commodity prices have not really gone up the same amount in terms of paying the rancher. All of the profit goes to the packers, which is a whole other story, you know, that we can talk about. And but in order to start a ranch, you have to be creative. And I would say that in order to start a ranch, you just have to start doing things that ranchers would do. It's like if you're an 18-year-old kid, like they're like, do you mind me asking your age?
I am 34.
34, same age as me. Wonderful. It's like, just think about you at age 21. If you're like talking to age 21, you're like, dude, you know what? If you wanted to right now, you could get up from your table, walk out the door, get on an airplane, and be working on a ranch in Australia or something in 72 hours if you wanted to bad enough. Like, there's an infinite amount of stuff that you could do. We could all go back to our younger selves and say, there's an infinite amount of stuff that you could do if you wanted to do it bad enough. So the biggest problem with most people is that who think about starting a ranch is they don't want to do it bad enough. The reason that I did it is because I wanted to do it so bad that I was willing to risk everything with a wife and a little newborn child. I wanted to do it. So, and that's why it's actually worked to the degree that it has worked. Now we're facing certainly some big problems right now in that, you know, I need more land and I need more cattle and I need to scale and scale and scale. And that becomes difficult at a certain point. You know, I get to 100, 150 cows. That works fine, tying those little pieces of string together. But the big pieces, once you want to, you know, really start to scale, you got to be playing in a different ball game. And right now I'm trying to figure that whole piece out. So in order to start, if you're a young person and you don't have any money, go find a ranch right now. There are tons of people that are turning regenerative right now. There are tons of people. And you go out and you say, I will work for you for 6 months for whatever it costs to keep me fed. Like, I will sleep in a tent in your backyard and just pay me whatever you think is fair to keep, you know, rice and beans in my mouth for 6 months. And then at 6 months, reevaluate. If you still want to keep me, then you can pay me a real wage. And if not, then that's great. I will have learned a lot, but whatever it takes for me to be at your side, learning how to do this. And that's the thing that I had that other people didn't have. You know, it's like, that when I was 18, I could just drive out to the ranch that my granddad used to run and say, hey, is there anything that you guys need help with? And, you know, 2 days later, I found myself working there full time. And that was a luxury. And that really, it's like, yes, I had an advantage and a privilege that other people didn't have. But what I did was I took stock of my assets and I deployed them in a way that I could succeed with. You know, and it's the same with having a wife who's a marketer. It's all about taking what assets you do have and deploying them skillfully in a way that gets you hopefully closer to the result that you can imagine. And obviously the important part is having a result that you can imagine so that you have to have something to aim at. And for me, like, I want to run 10,000 cows. And in order to run 10,000 cows, I have to get the necessary land mass to run 10,000 cows. In order to get that land mass, I have to get the venture capital to do that. In order to get the venture capital, I have to prove out my methods and I have to prove out the funding structure. And in order to prove out the funding structure, I have to collect the data that shows that I can put carbon in the soil, increase water retention, increase native species composition. And once I have that data, then I can build up those things. So I had a very clear goal, which is what you should do if you want to start out on a ranch, and then you work your way backwards to think, what do you have to get those things? So yeah, if you're a young person, go find a ranch, just learn the skills, because working with cattle is not easy. It is an art. It is absolutely an art, and it's frankly, it's quite dangerous, you know, and that's one of the reasons I'm really hesitant to take on an intern, is because I grew up in the culture. I know how cows operate and act. And I had my granddad yelling at me, telling me what to do. And I just sort of had a sixth sense about it from the time I was a kid. So it's very dangerous, and, you know, but it's also the most rewarding thing that I could possibly do. I hope I answered your question in some regard, but no. If you want to start a ranch, you just do it. If you want to do it bad enough, you'll do it. I mean, I'll tell you a story actually about my granddad. The ranch that I was talking about is called Billy's Creek Ranch now, but it was called the Green Ranch back in the day. And he was, you know, the foreman on the Green Ranch, and they had a camp and the camp was, in ranch terms, that's a house with a barn that's on another part of the ranch from the main house. It's called a camp. And so they lived out on the camp, and they had a barn, and they had the horses, and they had all the tack. And it was my granddad, grandmother, and my mom and her two sisters. And my mom was about 11, 12 years old, and she started asking my granddad, hey, Dad, teach me how to rope horseback. Teach me how to rope off horse. And, obviously they were all very skilled with horses, and they're very experienced, and they're around them all the time. And my granddad said, no, I'm not going to. And about a week later, she was persistent. She said, Dad, teach me how to rope horseback. Teach me how to rope horseback. And he said, no, I'm not going to do it. It's not time. I'm not going to do it. And about a week later, she was persistent again. She said, Dad, I really want you to teach me how to rope horseback. And he looked at her and he said, Nancy, if you'd wanted to do it bad enough, you'd already done it. And that's the best thing I can offer anybody regardless of what you want to do. If you want to do it bad enough, you'll find a way to do it. The resources are there. If you look for somebody to build you a step-by-step way of doing this, you're already behind the eight ball. So you have to cultivate an inner sense of wanting to do it so bad that nothing can stop you. And you have to be willing to fail your ass off along the way, because there will be plenty of that. I delivered a fetus through 2 weeks ago because I let my cattle get into some ponderosa pine needles, and which can cause premature birth or abortion. And so I had to intervene and deliver a fetus, which is, that's a $3,500 mistake for me. And so there's a lot of failing that happens along the way. So anyway, if you want to start a ranch, if you want to do it bad enough, you'll do it.
Hey everybody, this is Neil. We are going to get back to this great conversation in just 1 second. But I think it's fair to say that right now we are facing some pretty unprecedented challenges in the 21st century. I mean, you name it, environmentally, socially, economically, we've got some big problems that we need to overcome. And that's why, for me personally, and the people that work with us at Latitude, we want to dedicate our time and our energy so that we are not only working to put food on the table and a roof over our heads, but also make the world a better place. And so if you are at all interested in combining your sustainability values with a very powerful financial model of real estate, then I highly encourage you to check out what we are doing at Latitude. We are creating something truly special with a tribe of change agents that for now is working across North America. And hopefully one day in the future, with you coming on board, we can be working across the globe. So please check us out. You can go to www.chooselatitude.com, or you can find us on social media at latitude.realty on Instagram, and we are also on Facebook. Okay, let's get back into it. Let me ask you, you've got the 60 acres that you're leasing, and I want to pick it up there. How many head of cattle, if you're to do that conventionally, like your grandfather, how many head of cattle would he have put on 60 acres?
Probably 80 cows for 90 days, probably.
80 cows for 90 days. And what's your operation look like?
Well, if that particular operation, I can graze probably 1 cow per acre and get 3 grazings a year. So that's basically so that's 40 cows year round. So, and let's see, 80 cows and 9, that's 80 cows for 3 months, or 40 cows for 12 months, right? So that's, basically twice. I've doubled the stocking rate of conventionally, which is interesting, because in order to really pump the carbon cycle, you have to have more cattle, not less, because they're using the forage more efficiently, and the whole pasture except the part they're grazing is resting and converting solar energy into plant matter, and thereby putting carbon in the soil by feeding the microbiota through root exudates, and microbiota turnover every 12 to 24 hours. And basically your soil humus is dead microbiota. It's a lot of our fossil fuel deposits are dead plankton and stuff that have sunk to the bottom. It's like carbon. If we can really pump huge amounts if we can feed microbiota then that's how we store carbon. And so I can double the stocking rate. And I've put together another 100 acres since then. And, last year I ran my own cows. I custom managed some other people's cattle, and I finished 30 beef animals direct to consumer, mostly to Portland, actually. So with the amount of land that I have, I can run twice as many cattle as a conventional operation. And mind you, I run smaller framed animals for a variety of biological reasons. But nevertheless,
what are those reasons?
Okay, so the industry wants big animals because they want the most amount of beef per dead animal that comes out of their, it costs them a certain amount to kill an animal. So they want that animal to be as big as possible. But those large animals actually don't, they require basically more overhead, like a big building compared to a small building. Which one takes more electricity to run every day, right? And the big building. So these large animals contribute a larger amount of their caloric intake towards overhead processes, breathing, pumping blood, just various biological mechanisms. And on top of that, they do not consume as much per pound of body weight as a smaller animal. If you have an 800-pound cow and a 1,600-pound cow, you would expect the 1,600-pound cow to eat twice as much, right? But they don't. They actually eat only 67% more than the 800-pound cow, because the 800-pound cow has a faster metabolism. So it's running those processes more efficiently. And so basically what happens is you have a bigger animal that uses a larger percentage of the caloric intake to keep the lights on, basically doing other processes other than putting on meat, and that doesn't eat as much. So you have this smaller framed animal that puts on weight way faster because it's using less energy to pump for its biological mechanisms and more energy to put on weight. So they put on weight faster, they mature sexually faster, and they're able to eat more, which means if they're on really poor forage, they can consume more poor nutrition to actually get a higher net nutrition per pound of body weight than the larger animal. So what that is equated to is these massive packing houses want these big ass animals. And so what we have to do is we have to put them in feedlots and feed them a ton of corn and soybeans, which takes an astronomical amount of fossil fuels to grow, from all the way from pumping it out of the ground to growing, to using it to make fertilizer, and then trucking it to the cornfields, and then planting the corn, harvesting the corn, trucking the corn to the feedlots, trucking the animals. And sometimes they'll ship these poor calves off the ranch, the ranch I was, for instance, sometimes their cattle will be trucked 18, 24 hours overnight from like Oregon to Iowa or Oregon to South Dakota, so they can be finished in a feedlot. So it basically takes 32 calories of fossil fuel energy to create 1 calorie of corn-fed beef or grain-fed beef. Like, that's a massive waste of energy. It's a massive waste of energy. But because because we've been able to exploit all of this fossil fuel energy, then we've been able to make that work and make it pencil. So that's a whole different story. But basically, in order for me to double my stocking rate, coming full circle in the conversation, in order for me to double my stocking rate, I have to run animals that are more genetically adapted. And as I do that and the forage improves, I can continue increasing my stocking rate. Whereas if I just had a bunch of big animals and turned them out and they were able to go around and pick and choose the best stuff to keep themselves in good body condition, the forage would degrade over time. So we're looking at this from a total 180-degree angle. We're trying to use the principles that Mother Nature has instilled rather than trying to overpower her with fossil fuels.
Well, that tees up 2 questions for me. And the first is, if you're not trucking them off to South Dakota to get finished at a feedlot, what do you do differently?
Well, I finished them on forage completely. You hear a lot of people. You hear a big thing about grass-fed beef. I don't believe in grass-fed beef because grass is only one type of plant. You also have legumes, you also have broadleaves, and you also have brassicas. And most grass-fed beef, particularly in the Sisters area, is thrown out on like 2 or 3 types of grass. And how would you like to eat only 2 or 3 types of food your entire life? Like that would be shitty. It would suck. So what we do is we do everything we can to encourage, instead of using the fossil fuel that we have to truck them to Iowa, what we'll do is we'll use a little bit of fossil fuel to overseed a huge variety of plants. The 60 acres that I mentioned earlier, we have over 50 different species planted in that field. So our beef has a much more complex flavor than either grass-fed beef or grain-finished beef. So basically, we do that for two reasons. Obviously, we want our animals to have a lot of different forages so that they can have a better life. And number two, you have a much broader variety of biomechanical interactions happening in the soil. Like here's a good example. If you had a small town of 1,000 people, you could not have a functioning economy if everybody there was an accountant, right? You have to have a whole variety of different aspects of existence in order to create trading and moving back and forth and mixing up. And it's the same way with ecology. You can't have just one type of plant, one monocrop, and expect it to be healthy. You have to have a community. So in order to put carbon in the soil and improve the overall ecology, we need as many different types of plants as possible. So that's why we really try to encourage the polyculture. And so that also allows us to put more weight on our cattle faster. And it's just, they like it better. We put more weight on them faster. They finish with more fat than your average grass-fed beef, and it's way better for the soil.
Hobbs, what does that look like for the land? Have you seen an improvement or any difference since you picked it up from Jeremy? I believe you said his name was.
Yeah.
That had been left out.
In 2 years, we have seen an explosion in fungi in the pasture, and you see a much healthier pasture land is going to be have a higher fungal content than a monoculture or a fertilized pasture or a poorly grazed area. So the fungal content has been huge, and I know that because there's right across the fence is a conventional fertilizer monocrop hay field. And so all I have to do is look across the fence and see what the difference is. And so number one, there's that. Number two, just putting a shovel in the soil, you can see how much darker it is. We did baseline readings last year for organic matter content and the Haney test, actually. And so we'll be able to, when we go back in next year and do the test again, we'll be able to have data to back that up. But at this point, all of it's anecdotal. And so the soil is much darker and richer. The elk and deer are not interested in the hayfield next door. They're always on our property. And in the 2 years that I've been here, we have seen dung beetles arrive, and which is unheard of in this area. So it's just there are numerous points of interest that we could point to that show that the land has improved, and it makes sense, right? I mean, basically, there are stories of millions of bison, right? They had to stop trains for 3 days to let one herd of bison go by, and they created 14 feet of topsoil, in Illinois when they got there. They had to dig 14 feet down before they hit topsoil, and everybody who's tried to put a shovel in the ground and hit a rock immediately knows what that's like. Topsoil, you can just sink the shovel in, and you had 14 feet of that. Like, that's amazing. And what created that was the herd effect that we were talking about earlier, the prey predator herd effect that Savory basically discovered and popularized. And so if we, obviously we manage it correctly, the ground is going to get better. It's just, I spend so much time thinking about this all of the time. And I made a video this morning, like, how Elon Musk is looking for, he wants to award $100 million to somebody who can figure out the best carbon sequestration, mechanism. It's like, I don't think Mother Nature has a bank account. She has a carbon account. I mean, if you want, like, I made a video on TikTok this morning. I'm like, dude, just take that $100 million, become one of the biggest landowners, probably behind Bill Gates, who just bought all that farmland. I don't know why. and start putting carbon in the soil. Mother Nature already developed this. Like the Garden of Eden was a real place. If you go back and you look at Pleistocene ecology, you will recognize the Pleistocene. This is like my jam. I jam on the Pleistocene ecology. 2.6 million years ago, the Pleistocene started, and it ended about 12,600 years ago. So for basically a 2.5 million long period, which we hear about mostly the ice ages in the Pleistocene, right? But that was actually only like a small portion of the Pleistocene. Other than that, it was these massive herds of bison, camel, horses, mastodon, mammoths. Like, and a mammoth weighed like 10 times what a cow does. You know how big a cow poop is? Like, think about a mammoth poop, right? And so they're just like washing along, creating these unbelievable wooded savannas, wooded parklands. And in the Pleistocene, this is the best part. In the Pleistocene, the human brain doubled in size. It doubled in size. And in that, which wouldn't be that big of a deal, except for the fact that there's no evidence we created a single new tool during that period. So, which means that the ecology was providing everything that we could possibly need. It was so rich. There were these massive amounts of animals and huge herds. And they were moving, these migratory behaviors of these massive herds created this unbelievably fertile Garden of Eden. And somewhere, between basically 50,000 years ago and 12,600 years ago, it started to decline. And now we found ourselves with these big ass brains in a place where the ecology won't provide for us, and necessity being the mother of all invention, we started having to invent ways to manipulate the environment to feed us. And that has progressed all the way towards fossil fuels, which has resulted in 400 parts per million of carbon, and instead of the 200 parts per million, which was pre-industrial civilization. And during that whole period where there were massive amounts of mega herbivores that dwarfed the number of cattle and mega herbivores we have today, 200 parts per million was the average.
Well, Hobbs, this tees up a great question, because you brought up TikTok earlier, and you said you got a pretty big following of 100,000.
Yeah. That's it. I think that's, I'm just on the top side of micro influencer, I think is how they would say that. I don't know.
Oh, man. So what's the reaction that you're getting from people?
Well, there are the people who are, I think I'm actually what would a true progressive, not like necessarily one of those neo-progressive or a woke progressive person, but I think what I'm doing is truly progressive in the sense that, there's a small amount of regenerative people and open-minded, particularly urban people, who are very interested in what I'm doing. And I would say 80% of the comments that I get are positive or contributive in some sort of way. But the 20% of the people who have vested interests in continuing agriculture as it is, the oil people or the conventional grain people or the conventional cowboys or, the vegans, I get a lot of hate from those people. And actually, the vegans are the least of the problem, actually. It's the conventional grain farmers who spend their life tearing up the soil and coating it with pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizer in order to force it to grow genetically modified organisms in order to feed us this horrifying, unhealthy food that hate me. And, I get it. Like, nobody likes their personal mythology to be attacked, even indirectly. Nobody likes to admit or even entertain the idea that maybe the time that they've spent in their life has been spent in a way that was not necessarily productive towards the overall ecology or overall civilization. And I'm sort of, I'm kind of fearless in my ability to, or in my desire to call that out. There are a lot of regenerative people out there who want to do the whole touchy-feely nice thing, let's all get along, but I'm not interested in that. Like, I'm not doing anybody any good by going, you know what, let me just meet people where they're at. Everybody's going to be fine. Let's all just work together. No, fuck that. I'm not interested in that at all. Like, our practices have been destroying the planet. They seem like a good idea at the time, but right now we have the technology and the ability to change it. And if we don't do it, then we are not behaving properly. And behaving properly, as I see it, is contributing to civilization in a way that it does not degrade over time. We need to create a civilization that is repeatable over time without degrading. That is what behaving properly is, and destroying our soil function and releasing tons of carbon into the atmosphere is not that. So the people who want to give me a lot of guff about it, that's fine. Please do. I'm not going to be the guy on TikTok who's like, look at my cute cows and like me because I have nice cows and pretty land and blah, blah, blah. I'm going to be there saying, you know what? You guys are going to have to change because you're going to lose money and you're not going to have the amount of fossil fuels. That's the bottom line, is that whether or not they want to change or not, they're going to have to, because this fossil fuel insanity that we've been in for the last 100 years is going away fast. And the data is very clear on that. Energy return on energy invested. In 1910, you could get 100 barrels of oil out of the ground for the energy of 1 barrel of oil. Right now, the most productive fields are 1 to 5. And fracking is 1.5 to 1. So you have to burn a barrel of oil to get 1.5 out of the ground. And so if that doesn't tell you that we're on the that we're at the very, very end of the fossil fuel mania, then I don't know what to tell you. Then you're not looking at reality correctly.
What does that mean if you've got a significant amount of ranchers that end up transitioning to more regenerative practices? It seems like there's a first mover advantage by adopting those practices. But what does that mean 10 years down the road, that more and more people have started to do that? Does the economics change, in your opinion?
Well, it's sort of, the economics are going to change massively. It depends on how you look at it. If you're looking at it from simply selling the flesh of the animals that you've nurtured and then slaughtered, then which I don't say that in a bad way. I think there's a lot of honor in nurturing and then slaughtering animals to feed your community and your family. I think that's a beautiful, wonderful thing, and we all should not be afraid of death. And death is an amazingly natural part of existence, and I'm ready to go at any time. And my job, actually, my ethical founding of that is I'm going to exhaust myself in service of these animals and in service of my community. And once that's over, I'm going to die. And that's exactly the same thing I expect out of myself that I expect from those animals. So I try to develop a way to not be hypocritical with regard to the way that I treat those animals. Anyway, so basically, if you're looking at it from simply a perspective of selling beef, yes, the price of beef will go down because people will start managing regeneratively, and then they'll be able to increase their stocking rates, and there'll be much more beef available for everybody as long as we can have the processing ability, which is a big choke point in our current beef culture. Because the United States Department of Agriculture, heavily influenced by the lobbyists of the big beef packers, is like, no. If you want to sell cuts of beef, they have to be trucked to a slaughterhouse and examined by a guy in a white coat before they can be sold afterwards, which is a huge cost of carbon and transportation costs and is horribly stressful for the animals. And it's like, all right, thank you for your service. To get on this trailer, go to a place that smells like death and enjoy your last 12 hours there before we run you in this place and you're killed on a blood-stained concrete floor with surrounded by people you don't know. Like, thank you for your service. Like, that's great. So we got to change that. So obviously the price is going to go down as people increase their stocking rates, but that is not considering the real payment and funding structure that I hinted at earlier, which is going to change pretty soon. If you want to do anything in the economy that costs carbon, you're going to have to buy that carbon from somewhere, and that you're going to have to buy that carbon from somebody who's putting carbon in the ground. And so ranchers and farmers are going to start getting paid for carbon credits. And if you want to build a factory and you have to wipe out a little bit of native grasses or native whatever, you're going to have to buy native grass, what they call co-benefits in Australia, or native plant co-benefits. So from somebody who's increasing or preserving the amount of native species, or water banking or water retention. Any influence that you have on the overall economy, you're going to have to pay for by trading with somebody who is making it better. And that's going to be the agrarians. So a huge part of the funding structure of ranching and farming in the next 50 years is going to be what they're calling in Australia co-benefits. I don't know what they're going to call them here. It's just in the very seedling stages of paying ranchers and farmers for that. But they're way farther down the road in Australia. And so the reason that people are not able to pay for these ranches, and all the ranch owners are these people who've made their money in oil or big tech, or just have it handed down for generations, and their kids are trying their best to make enough money to not have to sell the ranch off, is because they're only monetizing the beef. And that's like, That's so inefficient. We need to be monetizing the carbon, the water, the native species, the biodiversity co-benefits. And once we start to monetize those, then ranching and farming is going to be the sexy thing again. You know, when people are like, I want to be a farmer when I grow up, and people are going to be like, instead, now it's like, I want to be an electrical engineer. Oh, Timmy wants to be an electrical engineer, but Andy, he wants to be a farmer. That's going to change. That's going to change in the next 50 years. So economically, it's going to change.
Yeah, that's a great perspective, but in one that I really don't know much about carbon credits, and I've certainly tried to expose myself to it, but it's an emerging field, and I hope that people appreciate that. Well, Hobbs, let's dive into the last question here. You're producing beef with the Sisters Cattle Company. How do you get that? If we wanted to order from you,
go to sisterscattleco.com, get on our waiting list. We harvest pretty much about once a year. The next several years we'll move to probably twice a year. But go to sisterscattleco.com, get on the waiting list. If you're in Central Oregon, which I don't know how much of your listenership is going to be in Central Oregon right now, but we have some available in the freezer. And but yeah, go to sisterscattleco.com, or you can email me at hello@sisterscattleco.com. You can get on our waiting list. It's really easy. We were able to. Here's the problem with local beef. Most people do the old way, which is put a deposit on your animal, and then once it's slaughtered, we'll give you the hanging weight so you can pay the rest of it, and then you have to pay the butcher, and that's 3 payments. People don't want to do that. It's ridiculous. So we've condensed it to just one upfront payment, and what we did this year worked out great. Was we loaded up. We handled everything for everybody. All you have to do is pay the amount up front and then show up to the Target parking lot in Wilsonville and get your beef out of our trailer. Like, it's really easy, really simple. That usually happens right around the 1st of December. We harvest in November, early November. It takes about 3 weeks to get it dry aged and then processed. So go to sisterscattleco.com, get on our waiting list. You'll get an email when it's time to purchase, and then we will basically Eugene, Salem, and Portland. We will trailer it to a place. You can come pick it up, and then you'll have a freezer full of beef that's not only delicious but also is making the environment better and civilization more sustainable.
Oh, I love it. You're just doing wholesale?
Yes, at this point. And we do a little bit of cuts, but that's what we were discussing earlier. We really like wholesale because that's the only way that you can sell on-farm harvest animals. So if I want to harvest the animal on the farm, which means they're eating grass in the pasture 1 second and the next second they're in a pen and harvested, instead of putting them in a trailer, taking them to the slaughterhouse, having them hang out in the slaughterhouse and then getting killed in a very terrified, scared place, which makes the meat not as good, number one. And then number two, is just a horribly unethical thing to do for these animals who we purport to love. So in order to do that, you have to own the animal beforehand. And then that's what's called a custom exempt slaughter. That's the only way that you can, the government allows us to sell it if we harvest it on farm. We believe very strongly in harvesting on farm as much as we can. And in order for you to have that beef, you have to own part of the animal beforehand. That's the rules right now. Hopefully we can get that changed. But so anytime you go to the store and you buy a cut out of the meat aisle, that animal has gone through a slaughterhouse.
Well, that's exactly the education that I love to get out of this show is really exposing people to the fact that there are different ways of doing this, and even buying the cow from you in the way that you're doing it. Most people have no idea that, hey, I could go out and buy a whole cow, half cow, split it up amongst families, things like that. And
it's cheaper per pound than you'll get at Whole Foods because it doesn't have to go through all those hands, doesn't have to have that fossil fuel cost. It's just it's better quality, it's cheaper, and eventually what I really want to do is I want to have some freezer space like in Portland where I can just harvest a bunch of animals, dump them in that freezer space in Portland, and people who maybe don't have the amount enough space in their apartment to put a freezer, they can just go down to the freezer space and get it. So that's the next problem. That's the next key with regard to this type of regional food system type beef, is that how do you get this into the cities? You can get it into the suburbs, no problem. People have a garage and they can put a freezer in there. if they have the capacity to drop $1,000, $2,000, $3,500 on a piece of beef or on a bunch of beef up front. A lot of people don't do that. And so if we want to make healthy on-farm harvested beef available to people, number one, we're going to have to be able to have the regulations change that we can sell cuts from on-farm harvested beef. Wyoming has actually already done this, by the way. So there's a precedent for it. And we have to find a way to get freezer space in urban areas so that these people can have access to it. Like right now, local, regional, on-farm harvested beef is a privilege of the wealthy or the rural. And it is sort of incumbent upon us to figure out ways to get it to people who can't afford to buy a whole quarter of an animal at one time. And, the people who most desperately need this nutrient-dense food, So, I mean, that's really the question that we're trying to figure out right now is that, like, how are we going to do this? And it's a really easy solution, actually. It's just freezer space in an urban area. And if like this, the possibilities are endless there. You're a real estate guy. I mean, you can easily see how that would be doable.
Yeah, I just got the wheels turning in the back of my head, and we'll certainly have to connect offline about that. But Hobbs, this has been an amazing conversation. If ranching, if you're looking for a side hustle, probably a preacher or a pastor, evangelist, whatever you want to call it, I think you'd make a great spokesperson in that regard. But I really just love what you're doing. I think it's a phenomenal story, connecting really what your grandfather was doing and really picking up that legacy. I think that I don't know him. I don't know your family, but I would imagine if it was my grandson that picked up the ranching legacy and is taking it in a direction of helping climate change and restoring water cycles and sanity and putting carbon back in the ground, like that's very admirable. And I hope you're successful in really staying true to the course and getting your 10,000 head of cattle, because that's going to benefit everybody.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I appreciate you for having me on. I'm looking forward to going through and hearing your other conversations, especially with the person who's the head of the Savory Institute. That'll be a really great conversation. Probably will build very productively upon this conversation.
Thanks, Hobbs.
All right.
Okay, everybody, that is a wrap. This is another just great episode that I'm so glad that you're able to tune in. And thank you for being interested in regenerative real estate. What we are trying to do is help people and planet thrive together by using the built environment as a catalyst. And so I've got a couple big asks for you. Number one is, can you please go to wherever you're listening to this podcast, leave us a rating and review. Those actually go so far. And since this is such a passion project for us, we really want to be able to attract the best thought leaders from around the world. Second is that if you really like the content that we're putting out, you can find us on our own Medium publication called Regenerative Real Estate. We also have a very active community on Facebook, which is called Regenerative Real Estate and Design, which you can request to be a part of, and we would love to have you. And third, this goes to what we do every single day, helping buyers and sellers demystify sustainability by working with people that want to either buy a property and are trying to figure out the financing of, how do I actually live out my values? How do I put that water catchment system on there? Or how do I go finance a solar panel PV array? Or maybe I want to live closer to nature. And what are the properties that are out there that I can do that? And so we represent buyers like that. We also happen to represent sellers that maybe they've already invested in sustainable features. Maybe they have a living building or a LEED certified project. We want to help tell that story. So much of what goes on in the real estate industry is transactional thinking at best, and it translates down into agents just really don't know anything about sustainability. And for us, we think that the value is there, and we want to help highlight really the intrinsic value of it, not just the bedrooms and the baths and the square feet of what typical marketing goes on. So if you know of anybody that wants to buy or sell these kinds of properties that we're talking about, please reach out to us at Latitude, and be sure to subscribe for another great episode coming up next week.